First, let us begin our video by discussing the origins of the Himyarite kingdom. The Himyarites emerged in the 2nd century BCE, when international trade along the Red Sea was booming via ports in Egypt, such as Berenike. Other prosperous polities during this century, such as Rome, Parthia, and states in India, like the Indo-Parthians and the Satavahanas, were engaged in a major network called the Maritime Silk Road. Geographically, Yemen was a bottleneck for Indian Ocean trade, and as a result, many of its coastal cities grew prosperous. Further inland, many tribes lived in the mountainous highlands, engaging in both agriculture and nomadism. From what we can surmise, before the rise of the Himyarites, the political landscape of Yemen was dominated by a coastal kingdom mentioned by the Greeks and Romans, the Manaeans, who were active in mercantile trade and practiced South Arabian polytheism. In addition, the Sabaean kingdom ruled parts of the interior, and seemed to overlap or compete with two other mysterious and poorly attested states, the Katabeans and the Hadramites. Finally, the kingdom of Aksum across the Red Sea in Ethiopia was an ever-present powerhouse in the region. As the 1st century BCE rolled around, the regional superpowers of Rome and Parthia began normalizing relations with each other, which resulted in increased trade between them along the Indian Ocean. Seeking to insert themselves into this lucrative maritime network, tribes in the highlands of the Arabian Peninsula began to move downwards and assert control over the Yemeni coastline, where they founded new port cities such as the Kana by the Hadramaut. According to Roman historians, during this time, the Himyarites emerged as the most powerful tribe in the region. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Roman travel guide published around the mid-1st century CE, mentions a king of two nations named Caribil, who ruled over the Himyar and the Sabaeans. With the Manaeans in decline, and the Katabeans and Hadramites defeated, and the Sabaeans tamed, the Himyarites emerged as unifiers of southern Arabia. The start of the 4th century CE saw the short reign of Damar Ali Yuhabir, who set up his own dynasty during 321 to 324 CE, and then the long reign of Tharan Yohannim, who intervened in Inner Arabia between 324 to 375 CE. From what we can surmise, by the 4th century CE, Himyar was now a powerful force in southern Arabia. After uniting the tribes, the Himyarites began to make incursions into the peninsula's center, securing the submission of the local tribes in the inland deserts. One king, named Shama Yarish, is said to have finally broken up the independence of Saba and also driven out the Aksumite kingdom from the coast. Eventually, the Himyarite kingdom had become powerful enough that its kings began styling themselves as the Kings of Arabia. Trade had always been an important part of the economy of Yemen, and with all her feuding tribes now united under the Himyarites, it was allowed to truly flourish. The Yemenites possessed many luxury goods which foreigners coveted. Frankincense and myrrh, considered prestigious and rare, were shipped through Sri Lanka all the way to the Imperial Chinese capital of Chang'an. Evidence of the Himyarite kingdom's long commercial tendrils lies in Hok Cave in Socotra. This cave contains a collection of multilingual inscriptions written in Ge'ez, Palmyrene and Prakit, foreign languages native to Ethiopia, Syria and India. This proves that merchants from faraway lands regularly made the long westward journey to Himyar. There are few surviving historical records of the kings who succeeded Shama throughout the rest of the 4th century CE, but we know that whoever they were, they ruled over the Himyarites when the kingdom was at the apex of its power. The capital of Himyar, called Zafar, expanded during this period. With its hills and large buildings, Zafar was reminiscent of the legend of the Imram of the Pillars, excavated by the archaeologist Nathan Drake himself. An advanced water irrigation system, facilitated by building many dams, facilitated fertile and stable local ecologies, which allowed agriculture to flourish and domestic food production to boom. Thus, through their economic management and clever utilization of their critical position on the maritime Silk Road, the Himyarite dynasty turned Yemen into one of Asia's most prosperous lands. Of the many unresolved mysteries the Himyarites have left modern historians, the religious and ethnic composition of the kingdom is perhaps the most prominent. Today, the Arabian people and the modern Arabian Peninsula is of course synonymous with the Muslim faith, but the Himyarites predated the birth of the Prophet Muhammad by several centuries. Having said that, the two other Abrahamic religions were going strong by the Himyarite Golden Age, and both would play a huge role in the pre-Islamic Arabian kingdom's story. Indeed, according to folklore, one of the kings of Himyar, Abu Karib Asad al-Kamil, was a convert to Judaism. As the story goes, at some point during his reign, Abu Karib invaded Central Arabia and besieged the holy city of Mecca, which was defended by Jewish and pagan tribes. During this campaign, Abu Karib is said to have fallen ill. As he lay sick in his tent, two Jewish sages, Ka'b and Asad, met him and persuaded him to stop the war. Moved by the wisdom of these holy men, Abu Karib recalled his armies and went home, bringing the two sages with him. This experience had a deep enough spiritual impact that eventually the Himyarite king converted to the Jewish faith. This is most likely a mythical tale, but there is also a significant shift from 370 CE onwards in inscriptions only mentioning one deity in proclamations. So what was the situation on the ground? Throughout late antiquity, the coasts of Yemen had Christian and Jewish populations, with both of these communities divided between many denominations. Many sects of Christianity, considered heretical by the Eastern Roman Empire, found sanctuary deep in the Arabian deserts, where they were out of the reach of the Roman Church's religious oppression. In addition, various Arab tribes still worshipped a pantheon of indigenous pagan deities, such as the solar god Shams. Moreover, faraway merchants from the Buddhist, Hindu, and Zoroastrian lands of India and Persia likely left a significant religious impact on Himyarite society as well. It's also possible that popular religions along the Silk Roads, like Manichaeism, were also present. Among the various surviving inscriptions from this era, there are dedications to a deity called Ilahan, which is a southern Arabian variation on the word Al-Ilah, meaning the god. It is very possible that the religions of the Himyarites had a profound impact on the eventual development of the Islamic faith in later centuries, although the extent of this influence is still hotly debated. Scholars are divided as to the nature of the religion, and we will provide a review here. Henotheism, or the acceptance of multiple gods but focusing on one, is one answer that some have considered, but without much discussion. Hanifiya, or the ones who had maintained monotheism in some form during the Jahiliyyah or period of ignorance, are attested in Islam, but this has been attributed to multiple figures, not to the Himyarite kingdom itself. Ramanan is also used for some local Arabian deities, but we're not sure if this was a henotheistic policy. Others have embraced the notion that Judaism was the religion involved. We have inscriptions of Jews in synagogues, like in Kani, showing a strong Jewish community in the region during this period. Some of the formulas in invoking this deity appear specifically Jewish, but most are more general in nature. We also have some un-Jewish practices, like ritual hunts, which are pre-Islamic customs in general. One counterpoint is that it was a looser form of Judaism, much like early Aksumite Christianity, which was much more general in its orientation. We also have similar concepts in the Hellenistic period, like God-fearers or Gentiles who sympathized with and used some Jewish practices, and the mysterious Hyperstarians of Anatolia, who merged worship of Zeus Hypsistos, or the highest, with Jewish practices. There is also a third theory, that of a general monotheism used as an integrative nationalism between the disparate Christian, Jewish, Gnostic, Zoroastrian, pagan, and hybrid denominations that populated southern Arabia. In this theory, a general, open monotheism, which both henotheisms and various monotheisms could identify with, was practiced to ensure unity. Many scholars, such as Valentina Grasso, Iwana Gajda, and Aaron Hughes, subscribe to this theory, leaving the possibility of experimental monotheism for Himyarites to use in a flexible manner. This can also be linked with the fluidity of religion during this period, which was not exclusionary and enabled other practices. This is also a difficult theory to prove due to its general nature. Whatever the truth, fascinating scholarship has emerged, and all provide a testament to the religious diversity of Himyarite Yemen. The son of Abu Karib, who was allegedly murdered because of his constant warfare, was Hassan Yuhamin al-Himyari. He seems to have continued the policy of monotheism and warfare, invading northern Arabia and destroying some northern tribes completely. His rule continued the tradition of the Himyarites working in alliance with the Makhalif, or the autonomous tribal ruler kings of the region. He is said to have even reached the borders of the modern Levant, but was turned back due to his allies being exhausted from the fighting. He then died in an uncertain time, with some sources claiming he was greedy and kept the spoils of war from local allies called the Aikals. These Aikals organized a coup which ended up in his assassination. After that, our record becomes murky once again. In the meantime, geopolitics was turning its wheel as Yemen's crossroads position on the Silk Roads brought it into conflict with its neighbors. There seem to have been diverging schools of geopolitical thought in Yemen, with a tilt towards pro-Persian politics. We do see various Byzantine ambassadors suggesting some good relations, but the Byzantines also had another ally in the region, the Aksumite Empire. The Aksumites were Christian and thus more in line with the Byzantine geopolitical bloc, and also controlled the western side of the Red Sea, right at the bottleneck near Yemen. Yemen and Aksum began to raise tensions in a sort of Cold War, as told in the 1001 Bell-Button Nights, written by David Al-Kanadiani. It is here that we move our focus to the coastal city of Najran, a city where allegedly a few Christian Nestorian and Miaphysite sects had taken root, possibly one of the earliest in Arabia. These were outwardly looking and mercantile societies. In the early 510s, a new Himyarite king came to the fore, called Yusuf Asa Yathar, or Dunuas, known in Syriac as Mesruk, and in Greek as Dimnos or Dunas. He is said to have begun raids on the southern coast, taking many livestock. He did this to avoid an Aksumite naval invasion, and one of his fears was a paranoia against the Christians of southern Arabia. Our sources come exclusively from Christian martyrological sources, but they go as follows. In the summer of 523 CE, one of his lieutenants, called Shari'il, began a blockade of the city, but the people would not submit. When Dunawas appeared, he is said to have promised to spare the citizens. The Najranites agreed, but Dunawas allegedly began a pogrom of the Christians and conducted a massacre of many Christians, such as the martyr Erathas. According to Cosmas Indicopleustes, when Emperor Justin I heard of this, he sent a letter to the king of Aksum ordering an invasion. With a naval force of over 80 ships, the king invaded the Arabian Peninsula and overran the Himyarites. Dunawas is said to have fallen into the sea and drowned himself. The Aksumite king Caleb overran Zafar and other major cities. This was a monumental disaster for Yemen, and while the massacre was the instigation, we can assume that other geopolitical games were at play. Massacres of Jews are recorded, as well as the establishment of many churches. Caleb preferred to keep the political structure of the kingdom intact, and thus installed a certain Himyarite Christian called Semiafa Awufa, or Asemiphios in Greek sources, though other sources claim it was another person from Aksum. This Asemiphios was to assist the Aksumites in opening up the Silk Road to the Indian Ocean for more silk trade. However, one of his lieutenants, Abraha, conducted a coup and overthrew him. His own inscriptions mention him conducting operations in Central Arabia, and still trying to ensure some independence from Aksum. He accepted embassies from both Byzantium and Persia, and was a capable ruler. After his death, his sons reigned for a short amount of time before instability grew. One of the last kings of Yemen, Saif ibn Diyazad, asked for help from the Persians, and King Khosrow sent some troops to him under a man called Warez. Both managed to fend off the Aksumites, but some servants killed Saif while Warez returned to Persia with many war spoils. The Aksumites tried to invade again, prompting Persia to intervene directly and fight wars for the next few decades. By the 570s, Yemen was a full-on Sasanian province, and it would remain so until the coming of Islam. So far, scholars have not discussed Sasanian sources about Yemen, so our historical record loses a lot of its clarity. Yemen, however, did not disappear. It was important in the early 600s as a trade hub, and soon a religious movement in the cities of Mecca and Medina brought Yemen into the world of Dar al-Islam, to which it remains today through both Sunni and Zaydi Shia denominations. The Himyarite kingdom remained legendary in the folk tales of Arabians, known for its wealth and possible Jewish affiliation. Despite their setbacks, the Najranite Christians remained strong until at least the 9th century CE. Paganism also faded from the region, with people letting go of Shams, Al-Lat, Al-Uzza and Manat. The Ramanism or Judaism of the Himyarites does not seem to have survived, though the Taymanim Jews of Yemen survive in large numbers worldwide to this day. The mysteries of the Himyarites remain, from details of their rulers to the exact nature of their religion. However, with every new discovery and every new inscription, we find more and more fascinating information about this kingdom of the maritime Silk Roads.
Writer and historian Dan Gibson has lived most of his life in the Middle East. He has extensively researched the peoples and places of the ancient world before Islam.
I first came to Arabia in my early 20s, and I've spent more than 30 years exploring every corner of this amazing part of the world, piecing together evidence for a radical new theory, which I believe will change our understanding of the past. Years of study have led me to the conclusion that Islam began somewhere other than where the conventional histories suppose, and that in early Islamic writings there are clues and references that reveal the hidden truth about the Mecca mystery. Back in 2002, I had occasion to visit a conference on Nabatean studies organized here by the Al Hussein bin Talal University. During the conference, I had occasion to speak with leading archaeologists from Saudi Arabia and from Jordan. I asked them specifically about the archaeological record in Mecca. While not wishing to be named or quoted, they admitted that there was no archaeological record in Mecca before 800 AD. I had expected them to defend the opinion that Mecca was a walled city with houses and gardens and public buildings and temples. They said no, there was nothing like that there.
Both Byzantium and Persia, and was a capable ruler. After his death, his sons reigned for a short amount of time before instability grew. One of the last kings of Yemen, Saif ibn Diyazad, asked for help from the Persians, and King Khosrow sent some troops to him under a man called Warez. Both managed to fend off the Aksumites, but some servants killed Saif while Warez returned to Persia with many war spoils. The Aksumites tried to invade again, prompting Persia to intervene directly and fight wars for the next few decades. By the 570s, Yemen was a full-on Sasanian province, and it would remain so until the coming of Islam. So far, scholars have not discussed Sasanian sources about Yemen, so our historical record loses a lot of its clarity. Yemen
Hello, I'm Dan Gibson, and welcome to another video about archaeology and Islam. In this video, we're going to look at a writer who was writing at the end of the 7th century. So this will be right about the time that Ibn Zubayr had his rebellion, and then Hajjaj came down to settle that rebellion. So he is a contemporary of these events. The writer's name is John Bar Penke. He is not a Muslim. He is actually a Christian writing from a Persian perspective. When I say Persian, I mean the Church of the East, which was established in Persia. He was there in Persia. So that's somewhere in Iran over into parts of Iraq at the time when he's writing this. But he's writing it right when these events are taking place. He's got a whole history of the world. A lot of the attention that he gives in his various volumes that he does are focused on the Church of the East and the Church of the West and the events that were taking place between these churches. But in book 15, he comes to the Islamic era. And we're not going to go into this in much detail, but he basically concludes that the rise of Islam and the spread of Islam and the suffering of the church was due to God's punishment on the church, which was not truly following the ways of God fully with their whole heart, and a lot of side issues had come up and a lot of controversy had come up, and so he felt that Islam was a punishment on Christians designed so that God would wake the church up. But in the middle of all of that, he makes comments about what is happening in the world of Islam and the things that are happening in his day or immediately before it. He mentions Muhammad, so Muhammad is mentioned by name, but he picks up the story with the Umayyads and with Muawiyah, and I'll just read a little bit and we'll get up to the part that I want to focus on. This won't be very long. Okay, when Muawiyah ended his days and left the world, Yazid, his son, reigned in his stead. He did not follow in the footsteps of his father, but he loved children's games and the pastimes of the idle. The strength of men declined under his weak government, and God took him soon after. When he had thus left the world, there was one of them, one of the Arabs, named Zubair. Now, this is Abdullah ibn Zubayr, who revolted against the caliphs who were in Damascus. That happened in 684, so during the time that John Penke is writing this. So we pick up the story with John Penke. He talks about Ibn Zubayr, and he's at Al-Zubair, and he said he was able to remain independent until 689 when he submitted to Abdul al-Malik, who made his voice heard from afar. Now Ibn Zubayr, he said of himself that he was come out of zeal for the house of God, and he threatened the West as transgressors of the law. So he went south into the place where there was a place of worship and settled there. A war with him was prepared, and he was defeated, and they even set fire on their own place of worship, and a lot of blood was shed. Now let's go back and look at that for just a moment, because we have Islamic history written down from this time. We've got Al-Tabari, who goes into quite a lot of detail. Other Islamic historians write bits and pieces about this time. So what is John Bar Penke saying about this that we don't have in Islamic history? Well, first of all, he's talking about Abdullah ibn Zubayr. That's the man who I say in around 70 AH after the Hijrah, about 70 after the Hijrah, I believe that Al-Zubair moved the Black Rock from Petra down to Mecca. All the mosques that we've looked at in the database face Petra. 60 of these mosques
faced Petra in the first opening years of Islam. And so we have that, and then we have trouble that comes soon after this. But at the time of Al-Zubair, all the mosques are facing Petra in Jordan. You can look at the Petra database. You can read the book, Let the Stones Speak. That's freely available in PDF format on the internet, on the website. So please avail yourselves of that if you are unfamiliar with the whole story of Petra and how many mosques faced there and when there was a shift down to Mecca. Now, I have been accused of saying I've invented this, and there is no written evidence anywhere that Zubair actually moved the Black Rock down to Mecca. So I want you to listen carefully through this. It says of Zubair, he said of himself that he had come out of zeal for the house of God. This is Beit Allah. And so at this time, Beit Allah is the Kaaba, the building that I believe, and I show in the book where I believe that building was and where the foundations are still to this day of the Kaaba that was in Petra. And so you can read that. There's a whole chapter that goes and looks at that building, Beit Allah. And so he has come out of zeal for the house of God. Why? Because the caliphs have moved the rulership of the Muslim world from Mecca, from Medina, and have moved it up to a secular city, Damascus. It's not an Islamic city, but it is a secular city filled with Christians, filled with people from other backgrounds, and there are no Islamic buildings there. There are no great Islamic things. Those have to be built, and so Muawiyah and others start to build some of these mosques and other places in Damascus, but Zubair is quite upset over this. The people in the holy city, which I believe was Petra, are quite upset. And so he has zeal for the house of God. And so he threatens the West. That's the way Penki puts it, because Penki is talking about the Church of the East, the Church of the West. And Petra was in the West, and Damascus was in the West as far as he was concerned. And so he talks about Zubair threatening the West as transgressors of the law. That's Penki's take on the problem there was between Damascus and the people in the more religious cities of Mecca and Medina, Mecca being the name for Petra at this time. So, and then now listen to this, because John Penki writes this, and it's a very interesting statement. He says, so he, that's Zubair, went south into a place where there was a place of worship, and he settled there. Now, what is this? This is a sentence that doesn't make sense in traditional understandings of Islam. Because if he was in Mecca and Saudi Arabia, where did he go south, and where did he settle, and what is this all about? Put the story in Petra, where I believe archaeology indicates this story took place. You can go to Petra, you can see the Kaaba, you can even see the ballista stones that were thrown at the Kaaba building. You can see where that Kaaba building was. Right beside it is the temple to Hubal, and right beside it is the temple, is the bathhouse, or Roman bathhouse, which we, in many writings, there are records of Muhammad apparently speaking and preaching in a bathhouse beside the Kaaba. A lot of those are claimed to be weak hadiths, because there is no bathhouse beside the Kaaba in Mecca, but there is in Petra. That's a very interesting point, but we won't pursue it. And so it says here that during this battle, remember the war went on for like 9 years. So this is a long, drawn-out battle. Penki's writing from a very far distance away. He's summarizing the whole thing in just a couple of sentences. And so he says, Abdullah Zubair has got zeal for the house of Allah, which I believe was in Petra, that he threatened Damascus, and so then Damascus is going to send down an army and defeat him. So it says, Abdullah Zubair, he then goes south and this is what I've been saying, around 70 AH, the black rock was moved from Petra south to Medina. So this is a long journey, and I don't believe that Abdullah ibn Zubair went south. I think the whole thing took place in Petra.
One major factor in how the Islamic Empire enjoyed such a blossoming of thought comes from Islam itself. Somewhat unusually, many parts of the Islamic holy texts, the Quran and the Hadiths, place value on education and scientific discovery, regardless of the information's origin. Muslim scholars did not, by and large, take issue with learning from the works of non-Muslims to advance their body of knowledge. A Muslim scholar by the name of Burhan al-Din proclaimed that education should be prescribed for everyone, a novel idea for the Middle Ages. Muslims would enjoy a high literacy rate due to their emphasis on learning and education as part of a well-lived life. Schools would not only give kids a good grasp of Islamic law and analysis, but bring young scholars from different classes and backgrounds together to share ideas. In a state as large and diverse as the Islamic Empire, this led to a lot of cross-pollination of ideas. Later in the Golden Age, this process of education was formalized by schools known as madrasas. They were mosques, boarding houses, and libraries in a single compound. Some of these became the first universities to give out degrees. Additionally, the Muslim Empire invested massively in the work of scientists and philosophers. The amount the government spent in translation was massive, rivaling some of the research budgets of our times. The symbol of this period would be the Great House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a massive library built by the Islamic Emperor Caliph al-Mansur. The House of Wisdom is so fundamental to the Islamic Golden Age that its construction and obliteration are viewed as the start and end of it. It was one of the world's biggest assortments of rare books in Persian and Arabic. The engine at the heart of this vast, growing Golden Age was the translation movement. The Islamic Empire in most of its domain contained 10% or fewer Muslims, and very few spoke Arabic. As they expanded into the Sasanian Empire, they found a large class of Persian scholars, as well as Greek academics who left the Byzantine Empire. The Caliphate connected them into a vast network of trade and information, but also added Arabic into the linguistic stew. Much of the information coming into the empire was in Persian, Greek, or Arabic, but could also be in Latin, Chinese, or any number of written languages from around Eurasia at the time. Scientific advancement aside, if the Caliphate wanted to function as an empire, it needed an army of translators to keep the flow of information running. When it made Baghdad its new imperial capital, the elites were inspired by Persian and Hellenistic ideas. It drove a desire to learn more from the classical Greeks. Furthermore, in the aftermath of the Battle of Talas in 751, the empire captured several Chinese prisoners of war. What might seem like a banal event turned out to be one of the most important breakthroughs, as it allowed for the translation movement and possibly the whole Golden Age. These prisoners knew how to make paper, which could make books easier than vellum or parchment. The first significant translation projects included taking Islamic holy texts like the Quran and translating them into various languages to spread Islam around the empire and the world. Furthermore, the classical works of the ancient Greeks and Persian texts were translated into Arabic, which would become a new lingua franca around the empire. Proficiency in Arabic allowed for a language between cultures. One particularly gifted linguist translated well over 100 works by famous authors like Galen and Hippocrates. In cases like the work of Aristotle, the Arabic translations are how the work even survived to modern day. Places like the House of Wisdom had extensive translation departments, with subject experts ready to work on pieces. These experts came from all over the empire, and many were Zoroastrians and Christians working with Muslims. Once a work was translated, they made several copies for distribution, using scribes with especially good handwriting. This movement is the work that kept the Western canon preserved. With that established, now we can look into the social sciences and the humanities, which in the Middle Ages is just philosophy. The social sciences were a long way off from being formalized. However, a man by the name of Ibn Khaldun, who lived during the Islamic Golden Age, is often considered the founder of many social sciences like demography, economics, historiography, and sociology. Ibn Khaldun was an upper-class Tunisian scholar. Due to the status of his family, he received a top-tier classical Islamic education. This education would include Arabic, Quran and Hadith studies, and law and jurisprudence study. He also successfully underwent the tasks to become a Hafiz, which is a torturous process very few Muslims do, to memorize the entire Quran. On top of this education, he learned maths, philosophy, and classical logic. But Ibn Khaldun didn't get into all of his social science work until after he finished a successful career as a politician in particularly unstable times in Tunisia. In the last years of his life, he penned an autobiography as well as a world history book called the Kitab al-Ibar, or the Book of Lessons. To this day, the book's chapters on the history of North African Berber people are still used as a source. In the book, he speaks of two different walks of life, both common in North Africa of his day, that of nomadic and sedentary peoples. He wrote of the effects of the conquest of a city on its inhabitants. Both are based on a central concept called asabiyya, or social cohesion. It might seem rudimentary, but this is considered some of the first works of sociological research. As he broke down the concept, he spoke of social factors leading to economic, political, and even psychological differences in cultures. This type of work would not see serious scholarly development until the 19th century. When discussing economics, it appears Ibn Khaldun is responsible for developing the labor theory of value, a central concept of economics even today. Ideas like economic growth, taxation, and GDP are centuries ahead of their time, if not a millennium. Lastly, he made a strict bifurcation of what he called the non-religious sciences and the religious sciences. It was an attempt to settle a significant debate between those who wanted to focus on science and philosophy, and scholars who promoted a mystic understanding of Islamic theology. Where the humanities shined, however, was in philosophy. Islamic philosophy in this age subscribed to one of two major currents. The first was Kalam, which focused more on questions to do with theology. This featured discussions about free will and rationality. One sect which took a rigorous adherence to rationality as the proper way to understand questions of theology were the Mutazilites. They in turn debated with any other schools, such as Maturidiyya, which did not see the hadiths as reliable texts at odds with reason, and largely believed in free will. Another major theological school was the Ash'ari, whose concepts of free will were limited to choosing possibilities outlined for you by an all-knowing God. Much of the logic and discussions these currents had with each other spoke of heavy influence from Greek philosophers. One medieval theologian, Ibn Taymiyyah, even described many of these discussions as Greek solutions to Greek problems, which should never have concerned Muslims in the first place. Ibn Taymiyyah's criticism speaks to another significant theological divergence in Islamic philosophy. All of these schools used reasoned approaches to Islam, and as such, rejected literalist interpretations. This did not go unopposed by some in the clergy, who worried that this kind of thinking challenged their status in society. However, the remnants of Kalam scholars still have a significant presence in the Islam of today. Kalam is now merely the word for theology, and Islamic theology is still very academic. The second major school of philosophy is what we might more easily recognize as philosophy today. Even at the time, they borrowed the word philosophy from Greek and called this school Falsafa. These were the scholars who discussed and built upon the works of Aristotle, Pythagoras, and Plato, publishing massive commentaries and philosophical texts. Some of these scholars were responsible for introducing their ideas, as well as those of the Greeks and Hindus, into Western Christian thought. This transfer of knowledge is one of the main reasons Aristotle went on to play such a significant role in Christian theology. One philosopher, Ibn Sina, broke ground in the realm of metaphysics. Metaphysics is the area of philosophy which attempts to understand the fundamentals of reality, the study of objects, properties, and existence itself. One major schism when it comes to the prominent Greek philosophers of Aristotle and Plato was a debate about forms. The form, or essence of something, is what makes an object fundamentally that sort of thing, its shape, highlights, and so forth. A triangle is a triangle because it has 3 sides, as a basic example. Plato believed that all things, even abstract things, existed in a world of forms, where the perfect idea of a thing exists. What we see are mere shadows of that thing. Aristotle rejected this idea, opting to believe that an object's form existed in this world, and that all objects were made of both object and form. Ibn Sina wanted to marry these two ideas in an exploration of the soul, and also to prove the soul exists. He did so with a thought experiment. It's a famous one from philosophical history, the floating man. In this, he wants to imagine a man falling freely in the air. With no ability to see other things in reference to oneself, a person could still experience their presence and consciousness. Ibn Sina believed this to be evidence that there is a soul, which is immaterial within, showing both external properties but also of another plane, attempting to marry the two concepts. This idea is very similar to the famous starting point for Descartes, who centuries later would become famous for his line "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am.
Albert Einstein was sitting in the patent office, and he had what he later in life called the happiest thought of his life. In 1907, Albert Einstein was sitting in the patent office where he was working after he got his initial degree in physics, and he had what he later in life called the happiest thought of his life. And strangely enough, this happiest thought involved the envisioning of an individual who was on the roof of a building falling off the roof and plummeting downward. Right now, what's so happy about that? Well, not so happy for that person who's falling, but for Einstein it was happy because he realized that as an individual is falling, he realized they don't feel their own weight. They feel weightless. And you can picture it, right? If they're standing on a scale, as they're falling with the scale, say, velcroed to the soles of their shoes, they're not pressing on the scale, and therefore the reading on the scale will drop to 0. That's what we mean by them being weightless. And that was vital for Einstein because he was struggling to understand the force of gravity. And if by going into free fall you could eliminate gravity, he realized you could eliminate a lot of the complexity that he'd been struggling with. And leveraging that idea into a new description of gravity, the general theory of relativity, it still took Einstein 8 more years to get there. So it's not like this happiest thought was the end of the story, it was the beginning of the journey. But it was the beginning of a new pathway toward the goal of deeply understanding the force of gravity. And Einstein achieved that in 1915 when he gave the world the equations of the general theory of relativity.
The eminent physicist Albert Abraham Michelson described the state of his science like this. It seems probable that most of the grand underlying principles have been firmly established, and that further advances are to be sought chiefly in the rigorous application of these principles to all the phenomena which come under our notice. Michelson, had lived this principle. In 1887, he and fellow American Edward Morley attempted to verify the existence of one of the oldest concepts in physics. They attempted to measure the luminiferous ether, the invisible, all-pervasive medium through which light was thought to propagate. Their experimental design was so ingenious, it couldn't possibly fail. And yet, it did fail. Failed to detect the ether at least. But in so doing, it succeeded in cracking the supposedly unassailable foundations of 19th century physics. The death of the ether helped open the way for the acceptance of Einstein's theory of relativity. So, today we're going to celebrate the life and death of an idea. As with so many ideas, the ether was born in the minds of the ancient Greeks. For them, it was the air breathed by the gods and was embodied as a primordial deity of light. In Aristotle's cosmology, earth, air, fire, and water are the physical elements of the world, while ether is the immutable and indestructible element that fills space and in crystalline state forms celestial bodies. That's right, ether is the fifth element. Big bada boom. Medieval alchemists were all about the ether, also called quintessence. They believed this spiritually pure element had miraculous capabilities of transmutation, and in some cases that it could be extracted by distilling huge quantities of human urine. It turned out that was phosphorus. Still useful, I guess. Fast forward to the mid-17th century, French philosopher René Descartes asserted that there could be no such thing as empty space, and Aristotle's ether therefore both filled and gave reality to the space between the celestial bodies. He imagined the ether as flowing, moving in vortices. These flows carried the celestial bodies, for example, in circles around the sun. The Dutch physicist Christian Huygens developed a detailed mathematical theory around this idea that gravity resulted from the fluid dynamics of the ether. But Huygens is most famous for his wave theory of light. By thinking of light as a wave, he was able to build a theory of optics, explaining how light refracted, bent in its path between different substances. And in Huygens' mind, that theory also required the ether in order to make sense. Consider a wave on a string. Each string segment moves up and down only, tugging on neighbouring segments so that a sinusoidal pattern flows forwards, while the segments themselves just oscillate in place. In sound waves, air molecules oscillate back and forth to propagate a pattern in the density of the air. All familiar waves, what we'll call classical waves, are a chain reaction that propagates an energy pattern through some medium. So if light is a wave, surely it also needs a medium. For Huygens, that medium was also the ether. He called it the luminiferous or light-bearing ether. This was in Huygens' 1690 Treatise on Light, published only 5 years before his death. Across the channel, a much younger Isaac Newton was sitting in Cambridge, making life difficult for Huygens. First, his theory on universal gravitation conflicted with the predictions of Huygens' etheric gravity. And Newton also opposed this whole wave theory for light business. Now, Newton's case is complicated. Some of his early ideas on gravity incorporated the ether, and he was also an avid alchemist, so must have studied the esoteric version of ether. Whether he also studied his own urine isn't clear, but he eventually came to the position that Huygens' luminiferous ether was bunk. He reasoned that if any medium filled the space between the planets, then surely it would cause a sort of drag that would impede their apparently perfect motion. Newton also favoured his own corpuscular theory of light, light as tiny particles rather than waves. Huygens versus Newton, light as a wave versus light as a particle. Most accepted Newton, as most always did. This was until the beginning of the 19th century, when Thomas Young performed his famous double-slit experiment. He showed that light produces an interference pattern passing between a pair of slits, like water waves do. These bright bands are points on the screen where the waveforms of light emerging from the two slits happen to line up perfectly, reinforcing each other. In between, the waveforms are out of phase and so cancel out. we see exactly the same effect in a pair of expanding ripples on the surface of water. So, light experiences refraction and interference like a wave. Add to that the fact that in the 1860s, Maxwell's equations predicted that electromagnetic waves should travel at exactly the speed of, wait for it, light. It was becoming pretty clear that light was indeed some type of wave, and waves need a medium, so the reality of the luminiferous ether seemed a done deal. And so we get to the end of the 19th century. With Newton's mechanics and gravity, Huygens optics, Maxwell's electromagnetism, physics seemed pretty much wrapped up. Albert Michelson and Edward Morley thought they'd help tie a bow on it by demonstrating the existence of the luminiferous ether as a classical medium for the propagation of light. The key was to observe a change in the speed of light, depending on the direction of motion. All classical waves travel at a constant speed relative to their medium. For example, sound waves travel at around 340 meters per second, depending on conditions, if you're standing still. But hop in a jet plane and you can chase your own sound waves so they appear to stand still. The apparent velocity of an object, or of a wave, depends in a simple way on the velocity and direction of motion of the observer. This is Galilean relativity, after Galileo obviously. You calculate what velocity everyone observes using the Galilean transformation, which is part of the foundation of Newton's mechanics. If I were a smug 19th century physicist, I'd want to hope Galilean relativity was right. Okay, so if light is a classical wave in some medium, then we should see changes in the apparent speed of light depending on our direction of motion. If you move relative to the ether, there should be a sort of ether wind, like when you stick your hand out of a moving car. Light should have a fixed velocity relative to that wind, but for you, it should be carried by that wind, faster moving behind you than ahead of you. That is what Michelson and Morley sought to measure. All they needed was a measuring device capable at travelling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, which in the 1890s I guess may have seemed challenging. But why build a fast-moving lab when you already have a fast-moving planet? Earth hurtles around the Sun at 30 kilometers per second. That's only 1/100th of the speed of light, but it should produce a change in the speed of light of the same degree. Michelson and Morley set out to measure that. Thus was invented the ingenious Michelson-Morley interferometer. In it, a beam of light is split in two by a semi-reflecting mirror and sent along two paths at right angles to each other. The split beams bounce back and forth multiple times before being brought back together again. And just like in Thomas Young's double-slit experiment, these beams would then interfere with each other to produce the bright and dark bands of an interference pattern. Once set up, a couple of things could change that interference pattern. One would be changing the length of either interferometer arm. That would cause the peaks and troughs to line up in different places. Changes in length quite a bit smaller than the single wavelength of light would produce observable shifts in the fringe pattern, and this is exactly the method that LIGO uses to detect gravitational waves. The other way to get a shift in the interference pattern is by changing the relative speed of light along the two arms. That would cause the wave pattern in one arm to lag behind the other, leading to a similar shift in the pattern. So let's say you set up the interferometer and you see your interference pattern. To start with, you wouldn't know whether the arms were exactly equal lengths or whether the ether wind was blowing one way or the other. But actually, none of that matters. You'd see the bright bands of the interference pattern at the locations where the beams happened to give constructive interference. That interference pattern should stay fixed as long as the path lengths stay fixed and as long as the relative speed of light between the arms stays fixed. But if the speed depends on the direction of the ether wind, then just rotate the interferometer by 90 degrees. If the speed of light was faster in one arm than the other due to the ether wind, then the speed difference gets flipped when the device is rotated. The interference pattern should shift to reflect this. That is the Michelson-Morley experiment. For extra genius points, they floated the whole setup in a tub of frictionless mercury so it would maintain a fixed orientation despite the Earth rotating beneath it. It was also beautifully designed, and it should have detected the ether wind if it existed. Of course, you know what's coming. On rotating the device, the interference pattern didn't budge. Okay, so maybe the ether happens to be moving exactly with the Earth. Fine, try it 6 months later when the Earth is moving the opposite direction. Still no pattern movement. This may be the most famous null result in the history of physics. There appeared to be no luminiferous ether, at least not one that resembled a classical medium for wave propagation. The speed of light appeared to be independent of the motion of the observer. That contradicts Galilean relativity, and so revealed a crack in the sacred Newtonian mechanics. This directly inspired Hendrik Lorentz to derive his Lorentz transformation, an update to the Galilean transformation that now allowed the speed of light to remain constant no matter your velocity. And that brings us to Einstein. The constancy of the speed of light and the Lorentz transformation are fundamental to his special theory of relativity, which was published 8 years after the Michelson-Morley experiment. Now, Einstein's starting motivation seems to have been the fact that the Maxwell equations are also a little broken under Galilean relativity. But the death of the ether gave Einstein two things. It inspired the Lorentz transformation critical to both special relativity and then his general theory of relativity that ultimately overthrew Newton's theory of gravity. And according to Einstein, it revealed the cracks in the foundations of physics that allowed his ideas to be accepted. It's commonly stated that the ether is disproved, but let's be clear, the ether as a classical medium for light is dead. However, the general concept of the ether sort of has an afterlife. Einstein talked about the new ether as the medium of the gravitational field, and which we now think of as the fabric of space-time. Paul Dirac suggested that a particulate ether could explain the near-vacuum state of space-time in which quantum physicists believe particle pairs are quickly born and destroyed. In retrospect, Descartes seems prescient. Empty space is not really empty, its flowing fabric is the source of the gravitational field, and it's full of quantum fields. And what about Albert Michelson? Well, it seems that he could never bring himself to accept his own result. He appears to have believed in the luminiferous ether until the end. When Einstein visited Michelson on his deathbed in 1931, Michelson's daughter begged Einstein not to get him started on the subject of the ether. Michelson may have mourned the death of the idea and the passing of the sensible, down-to-earth world of 19th century physics, but that death helped spark the revolutions of relativity and then quantum theory that reveal a much weirder, but still totally luminiferous, space-time.